大家好，我叫何非凡. Hi everyone, my name is Anthony. Today we're going to take a look at all the tea in China because it's hugely important culturally and historically, and it's just really popular. China produced, it's the world's biggest producer and consumer of tea, and they consumed 1 million tons of the stuff in 2010 alone. It's grown every year since then, so it's worth taking a look at this incredibly important plant. And that's what it is. Obviously, it comes from the tea plant, Camellia sinensis, which is an evergreen shrub native to Southeast Asia. It grows best with sun and rain, like subtropical or tropical climates, but it's very often grown at altitude because that slows down its growth and produces better flavor. When it's cultivated, it's usually trimmed to about yay-high, 5 feet or so, to make plucking and harvesting easier. But if you just let it grow by itself, it'll turn into a big old tall tree. But that's not where tea tree oil comes from. If you've seen like all the cosmetic stuff with tea tree oil, that's a different thing. It comes from Australia. But anyway, what we're looking at here is all the different kinds of tea. So there's about 6 major types in China: green tea, yellow tea, white tea, oolong tea, red tea, hong cha, which we in the West call black tea, and then pu'er cha, which is pu'er tea. It's this fermented and very different type of tea. But again, it still comes from the same plant. And all of these different types are produced using different methods of processing. So a green tea is minimally processed. They steam it or pan it or roll it or dry it, let it dry in the sun, and that produces nice green tea, which is the most popular in China. But there's all sorts of different methods to get black tea, which is oxidized, strictly speaking, and not fermented. Fermentation involves microbes. That's how you get the pu'er tea. And all the rest of these are oxidized to various degrees using all of these different methods of processing. So if you're into that, you'll have to Google it yourself because I don't have time to go through it all, even though I think it's cool. And the words for tea, this is interesting to me. There's only a few words for tea in all the world's languages. They come from 2 sources. They either come from Minnanhua, spoken in Fujian province, I guess hundreds of years ago, and still today. Their word is ta or te. It starts with a T and it ends in a vowel, and that's how you get all of the different things like te or tea or tea or tea. See, they're all really similar because all of those countries had their first encounters with the tea product through shipping that came from Fujian province, which is one of the biggest producers of tea in China. It's right here, Fujiansheng. And so the tea that was produced there and the merchants who carried it from there used the word based on Minnanhua, tea. But the others used the Sinitic cha or sha, whatever it was in Old Chinese. It sounded more like cha. And so all of the countries that got their first impact with tea through exporters that took it from other regions of China that used that word, their language uses words for tea that sound like cha or che or chai or anything like that. And if you notice over here in Portugal, they're a red dot in a sea of blue because they got their tea for the first time from Macau rather than Fujian. So their tea also came by sea, but they're sort of the exception that proves the rule. And so in countries like Burma or other languages native to Southeast Asia, they have different and unrelated words for tea that sort of arose organically because they always had the tea plant. And so they didn't get that word from another language. But anyway, linguistics aside, let's look at some famous Chinese teas. The most famous of which probably is Longjing cha. Longjing tea means dragon well. It's probably the most famous tea from China. They served it to Richard Nixon in his famous 1972 visit, which sort of tells you something about the way they view this particular tea. If this is what you serve to visiting dignitaries, it's probably the best you got. It's a mild and sweet green tea grown near Hangzhou. It's produced in quantities, so it's not so expensive. If you get a chance to try Longjing tea, jump on it. Other ones include Da Hong Pao, which is old and has lots of legends associated with it. It's very expensive. It's grown in the mountains of Fujian, in the Wuyi Mountains. So it's a rock tea. There's lots of teas that are grown in the Wuyi Mountains. And its flavor is strong and sort of earthy. I haven't had it, so what do I know? But it's really expensive and very, very famous. Da Hong Pao is one of the most famous in China. I should say it's an oolong tea as well. It's a dark and heavily oxidized oolong tea, as compared to another type of oolong tea, Tie Guan Yin, which sort of translates to Iron Goddess of Mercy. Guan Yin is the Bodhisattva of mercy. This one is also produced in Fujian, in a place called Anxi. Some people call it the king of tea. It's thought to be one of the best varieties of oolong. It's much more lightly oxidized, so its flavor is more floral and green. This one is a white tea, Silver Needles, by Haoyin Zhen. So this is like a top quality, people call it, it's one of the major varieties of white tea. One of the only varieties of white tea that's considered premium. It's made from just the young buds of the tea. So it's plucked in an early spring, like right away when the bushes are ready, I guess. But it's meant to be prepared with water that's not quite so hot and steeped for longer. That way you bring out the more delicate flavors and not like scorch the buds, I guess. This is a white tea, so it's very minimally processed. It's very delicate and, again, pretty expensive, but that's why it's famous. The last one I'll talk about is pu'er tea, which is really a whole category of teas. These are the post-fermented teas, so these are like truly fermented. They use bacteria and yeasts and other microbes to break down some of the components in the tea leaves themselves and produce new components that give the tea really a whole spectrum of flavors. There's all sorts of pu'er teas. There's like a raw tea, there's a more mild one. I don't know enough about pu'er tea because I think it smells like feet. But some people swear by the stuff. There's a lot of varieties of fermented beverages like this that people really like. If you know kombucha, you can go to Whole Foods and get kombucha. That's a fermented drink. People think they have health benefits, which is possibly true, right? Like yogurt is a fermented thing. So some of the foods and drinks that we use that are fermented with microbial action have a lot of health benefits. But this is one of those things that you love it or you hate it. And I haven't had enough of it to love it yet. So if you get a chance, give it a try. But tea in China has a really long history, going back to like the mythological origins of China itself. So the legend goes that Shen Nong, the divine emperor of agriculture, was sort of the first person to drink tea, and it happened by accident. He and his servants were boiling a pot of water to drink, and some leaves fell in the water, and it smelled good, and Shen Nong thought, I'll drink it, it smells nice, and that's how it all began. So Shen Nong is a really interesting mythological figure. There's a few of these like sort of divine emperors in Chinese mythology, but that's a topic for another time. I wish I knew enough to really tell the tale of Shen Nong, but he's basically the Isaac Newton of tea. He was the one that started it all. As far as physical evidence goes, moving away from legends, we know that tea was drank at least as early as about 200 BC. A few years ago now, there was physical evidence found in a tomb of like brick tea, which is how it was prepared. For a long, long time. Definitely how it was originally prepared. We know that because of Lu Yu and his classic of tea, which he wrote in the Tang Dynasty. In fact, this is also where we got the tale of Shen Nong. But I'll get there in a sec. The idea is, in 2016, in the tomb of the Jing Emperor of the Han Dynasty, remains of plant matter were found that were identified as Camellia sinensis. So, at least as early as 200 BC, we know for sure that the Chinese were drinking tea. And it was probably a lot earlier than that. So, in the Tang Dynasty, when a lot of scholars sort of figured out, hey, we got to start writing this stuff down, there was a literary explosion in the Tang Dynasty, and one of those classics was Lu Yu's Cha Jing, the classic of tea, and it's extensive. It includes all sorts of topics all about, how tea came about, how you're supposed to make it, how you should serve it to your guests. So this was really, by this time, tea was such a major thing in Chinese culture that this guy spent a big part of his life writing a encyclopedic book about tea, and that was in the 8th century. So tea as a ritual has been around that long, at least. It's a way to welcome guests, develop formal friendships, celebrate weddings. Chinese tea ceremonies can be really elaborate and really beautiful. They're meant to be relaxing and welcoming. There's different kinds of them. One of the more famous ones is the Gongfu cha, Kung Fu tea, but really Gongfu in Chinese just means effort or skill. And so there's a whole set of rules and a whole set of equipment that you need to make a proper Gongfu cha ceremony. But I don't know enough about that to get into it right now. The point is that ritual tea ceremonies are and have been a really important part of developing relationships in Chinese culture for a very long time. So how do you take your tea? In China, most people brew it and drink it straight. They don't add things like milk or sugar, partly because Chinese people just don't drink as much milk as we Westerners do, but also because there's this idea in Chinese cooking where whatever you're cooking with, you should try to highlight its characteristics rather than totally change them. So if you're cooking a Chinese dish, you're probably trying to highlight the characteristics and qualities of the ingredients. And the same sort of applies to tea. All this effort went into growing it and processing it and producing it. You should probably just let it stand on its own and enjoy it the way it is. But that isn't a hard and fast rule. There's clearly exceptions to it. Like in places like Hong Kong, they have this Hong Kong style milk tea that sort of comes from the legacy of British colonialism, right? They took that tradition of adding milk and sugar to your tea and co-opted it and modified it and made it their own. So there's this Hong Kong black tea where they add evaporated milk and a little bit of sugar, I think, and some secret ingredients, and they produce something that's very unique. I haven't had the pleasure of trying it myself, but I hear it's fantastic. So Hong Kong style milk tea is definitely a departure from the norm of drinking tea straight. And the same is true for Taiwanese bubble tea, which is gaining popularity really, really fast. They've added things like tapioca pearls, things like fruit right into the tea, milk and sugar for sure. The Chinese word for this is zhenju nai cha, pearl milk tea, and it's hugely, hugely popular nowadays. So however you take your tea, find yourself a cup and man man he, 再见.